My search to find the greatest film of all time has now reached 1975. Welcome to my ranking of films which came out in the year 1975, or at least the ones that I've seen anyway. The top film today will go through to the eventual grand final, and the film which comes second may also end up in that final, numbers permitting, because I'd like to have 100 films exactly for the grand final. Now, when I started planning this particular video 1 or 2 weeks ago, I realised to my horror that I'd only seen 7 movies from this particular year. That was completely unacceptable as far as I was concerned. So I have been furiously binge watching more movies just to bump the numbers up a little bit. I've watched 4 more movies actually. So now we have 11, which is a much better number. There are some really great movies towards the top end of the list today, some near the bottom, maybe not that great. I will point out as we're going along which movies are relatively new watches for me and which ones, in some cases, I've not seen for decades. So that's enough waffle. Let's get into it and find out what is my officially 11th favourite movie from 1975. So bottom of the list today we have The Man Who Would Be King, which is quite a well-respected film the world over, I think. So don't take my word for it necessarily as to its quality, but it's certainly a film that I couldn't really get into. The story is about a couple of guys, I think they're deserters. It's been a long time since I saw it. This is not one of my newer watches. And these guys end up in some kind of primitive village, and one of them gets proclaimed king of the village by accident, I think, and then the story goes on from there. I think it tries to be funny from memory, but it's not funny enough to be a comedy, and the drama's not serious enough to work on that front either. So it's kind of in the no man's land tonally, and it just wasn't for me. But it is regarded as something of a classic, I think. It's got Michael Caine and Sean Connery in it, 2 legendary actors. Now, I love these guys to bits normally. There are so many films with Caine and Connery in them that I absolutely adore, but this is not one of them. This one time that I can think of that they came together just didn't quite work for me. This film came out around about the late 30s, early 40s, I think, but it was re-released in 1975. And because I'm not intending on ever doing a rankings for as far back as when Snow White originally came out, I will allow it to enter the competition at this stage on the technicality. Now, I will always have a special place in my heart for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs because it's a story I've told to my kids at bedtimes many, many times. It's one of my go-to stories that I can just tell off the top of my head. In terms of the movie, I've only seen fragments of it in adulthood. As a child, I would have watched the whole thing. It is more of a girls' one, this, than a boys' one, I think. But I've got no complaints or negatives to say about this film. It's a fine film for its genre. It's a very good film for its genre, actually. People will still be watching this 1,000 years from now. If you're into Disney animation, then you probably like Snow White. It's a good movie. This is a film I only watched for the first time last week. It's about this guy played by Robert Redford who works for the government, and he goes out for lunch one day from his office in downtown Manhattan, I think it is. And while he's out, all of his colleagues get murdered by these terrorists actually in the office where they work. So when Robert Redford gets back to the office, he discovers all these dead bodies. It's quite a chilling opening to the movie, actually. And I was fully invested in it at this point. But then it becomes this kind of enemy of the state, Born Identity kind of deal with Robert Redford on the run, and he's not sure if he can trust the FBI. He's got terrorists after him as well. It sounds good, but it's not. And there's this whole cheesy subplot where he kidnaps this woman and they end up falling for each other. And past a certain point, I was just kind of like, come on, get to the end. I've had enough now. So it's an okay thriller, but definitely one which was at its best back in the 70s. I can't imagine that many people would get that much out of it today if they were discovering it for the first time. Robert Redford's very good. I've never seen him as a younger actor in anything before, but he carries the film very well. And I think Max von Sydow plays one of the terrorists, and he's quite an interesting character as well. I saw both French Connection movies back to back in the same week, probably I want to say 8 to 10 years ago. I didn't enjoy the second one as much as the first. And if I think back to when I did the 1972 rankings in this series. I think I had the original French Connection coming third, or almost made the grand final. But today we've got French Connection 2 way down in eighth. And I think my biggest problem with this film is the fact that it changes locations from, I think the first film's in Chicago, but it's in one of the big American cities. I can't remember exactly which one. But in this film, Gene Hackman's character goes to Marseille to chase this crook. And even though Marseille is an absolutely fine city, beautiful place, no doubt about it, I just don't think it works as a great backdrop for this particular character. And I don't like it when characters get moved out of a city where they were doing perfectly well in their original film or some of their early films. So another example would be in the Shaft series. The first two films take place in Harlem, which is great, and then they move the character to Africa for the third film, and that one just wasn't as good for me. Similar thing with Dirty Harry. In the fourth film, Sudden Impact, they take him out of San Fran, and for me, that's the weakest of that particular franchise. So there's a pattern there, especially with some of these 70s franchises, and in the French Connection 2, they do exactly the same thing. I didn't need to see this character chase down the crook from the first film who got away. You know, I would have liked to have seen another French Connection film, just keep it in Chicago, wherever it is, and just have him go after somebody else, you know, a different case entirely, and maybe this time he will win, and that will be our satisfaction. I didn't really feel that much when, at the end of French Connection 2, he finally kills that guy. I was kind of like, okay, but I've not enjoyed this movie anywhere near as much as the first one. Having said that, it's been a long time since I saw either film, and I would definitely be interested in going back and checking them out again, just to give them a second try. Maybe I would like the second one more the next time around. Now we've reached the really good films, and we're only at number 7. The Picnic at Hanging Rock, though, is probably the film on this list which I remember the least well, because it's a long time ago now that I saw it. I think I was a teenager when I watched it. And it really fascinated me at the time, this case of these kids who go missing at this big weird rock formation thing. But I'm really hazy on the other details in the film. I had to go on Wikipedia earlier and just remind myself of some of the other stuff that happens in the movie away from the hanging rock place. But it's definitely a one-of-a-kind movie in terms of the story that it tells and what it doesn't reveal. I think it will frustrate some people, the resolution or lack of in this film, but I definitely really, really want to revisit this film. I've not seen it in way too long. This is a film which goes by a few different titles, I think, but in the UK it's definitely called The Ghoul. I watched it a couple of times on TV as I was growing up. It's not actually got a ghoul in it, this film. The killer is very human, he's just very antisocial, and he's never learned to mix with people, so his dad keeps him locked in his bedroom, but every now and again he escapes his room and walks around in sandals and kills whoever's around at the time. It's better than it sounds. Now, we start the film following this group of people who have just left this party, and they go on this drunken car race to Land's End, but they get lost and end up on the moors down in the southwest of England where this film takes place. And eventually they come across the mansion where the ghoul lives, if we just call him that. And that's where the main horror begins. Peter Cushing plays the dad of the ghoul, and John Hurt's in the film as well. He's like this really mean-spirited gamekeeper who's arguably worse than the actual ghoul, but it's a good film. It's dripping with atmosphere. There's something about the southwest of England which just lends itself really well to horror films. Sadly, I've not been able to find this film on DVD. I did buy this really dodgy copy of it off someone off eBay once. I think he just downloaded it off the internet or something and put it on a disc, but the quality of this particular disc was so bad that I just had to chuck it in the bin ultimately. It only cost me like £3. I think it might be on Amazon now, but in a really kind of scratched way that's not that watchable. It desperately needs some work doing to it, this film, but you know, it was made back in the 70s and probably there's not a lot of demand for it, but it is a decent little horror film if you like your 70s horror. A few years ago, I decided to have a Sylvester Stallone season and watch loads of his films in chronological order, so I ordered a copy of this film, Death Race 2000, but by the time the DVD turned up, I'd kind of gone a bit cold on the idea, and so this film just ended up on the shelf, not even being watched. And this was like 3 or 4 years ago. Now, the other night when I started planning this video and going through lists of films from 75 on Wiki, trying to identify what I'd seen, etc., etc., I spotted this film and thought, hang on, I've got a DVD copy of that and I'd never watched it. So I put it on, and to my surprise, it's an absolutely gloriously good film, and I've had it for years and not watched it. It feels very kind of like RoboCop in terms of its satirical, futuristic tone. You know, life is not worth a whole lot in the world of Death Race 2000, but it's a funny film. It's entertaining. It's gory and violent. It's got some great characters in it. David Carradine, who I've only previously seen in Kill Bill as a much older guy, he's in this playing this guy called Frankenstein. Sylvester Stallone sort of plays the bad guy in the film, actually, and it's just really, really good fun. It's like an adult version of Wacky Races with people dying in these really violent ways. They went on to make quite a few sequels and reboots, but they were all kind of way after the first film, so I don't know if the tone is different or in those or whether they're even of the same quality, but I certainly love to check them out. I think the first film, well, obviously the first film came out in 75. We're doing a 75 list today, but I think the second film didn't come out until like 2008. So I will explore those later films, but I'm sort of tentative about what I'm going to find with those. But this was a real surprise to me. Death Race 2000, it definitely needs a cleanup though, because the copy that I've got, it's all kind of scratched and you can't play it fully on my 65-inch TV. It only plays on like a letterbox in the middle of the screen, so I really hope I can get a really nice, clean version of this film one day, because it is awesome. This is one of the films I only watched for the first time last week. It's about this spy played by Clint Eastwood, who also happens to be a great mountain climber. So when there's this guy one day who needs killing, who just happens to be on this Olympic standard climbing team about to go off on an expedition up a really tall mountain, obviously Eastwood's character is the perfect man for the assassination. The trouble is, he doesn't know which member of this team needs killing. So he's literally on the mountain with three other guys in the final act of the movie, and he doesn't know which one he has to kill. He just has to sort of bide his time and hope that he figures it out before whoever the killer is figures out that Eastwood's after him. So it's an interesting setup. We don't spend the entire film in this situation toward the end. There's a lot of build up where Eastwood's character is sort of training for this mission because it's been a while since he's done any mountain climbing, but it's a good story. I think it was adapted from a novel by Robert Ludlum. I could be wrong about that, but the whole film's full of Eastwood's trademark cynical one-liners. I found it really entertaining, and the scenery in this film is absolutely breathtaking. I mean, we get to see, I think, the Mojave Desert in America, and then we get to see this huge mountain in Europe, and they're actually on this mountain doing the filming. It's some really great stuff. I could really see myself going back to this film in the future. Actually, I'm surprised that it's not one of Eastwood's more famous of his old movies, I suppose, but it's really, really good. Highly recommended. So here we have another film which I've only just got done watching for the first time. Deep Red is a horror film. It's by Dario Argento. Now, I probably would have gotten around to watching this film eventually anyway, because it's always been my intention to go through Argento's filmography, because I love some of his later films, Suspiria and Inferno. This is very much a giallo movie. It's over 2 hours long, which is long for a horror film, but it's got a nice mood to it. It is quite creepy. The soundtrack is absolutely amazing. It mostly takes place in Italy, and there's some really nice locations used for this, some great architecture, and I just thoroughly enjoyed the film, and it's definitely one which I will keep on my shelf and rewatch in future. This is probably the most famous film on this list. It's a hugely respected film. People love Jaws, irrespective of whether they like horror, usually. I think if you did a poll about 1975 films, Jaws would probably win it for most people. I've got it at number two. There is one more film that I love more than Jaws from this particular year, but I still love this movie. I've seen it 10, 11 times throughout my life. I probably watched it too much, actually. I mean, there have definitely been times when I've been watching Jaws and not been that into it because I've just overwatched it. You know, that can happen sometimes. Probably a lot of people have had a film that they've just watched too often and it starts to affect their enjoyment of the movie. I think Jaws might be that movie for me, in all honesty, but I've tried to take a logical approach when it comes to ranking it on this list, because originally when I started writing these films down for this, I had Jaws at number 5, and I thought to myself, come on, Jaws below Death Race 2000? No, I've got to, even though I've way overseen this movie, I've got to at least try and just think about it in terms of its quality rather than the fact that I've watched it way too much. But God, this is a great film. It's so well paced. It's got great characters. I mean, what more can be said about Jaws that hasn't already been said? I think the quality of the sequels kind of has damaged the first film a little bit. You know, I'd never get that enthusiastic about doing a full run through of the Jaws movies because once it gets past the first film, things get ropey in terms of 2, 3, and 4. But Jaws 1 is absolutely amazing, and I am sure we will see it again for the grand final because it's come second, it's earned itself a playoff spot, and most of the films which come second will be going through to the final. But let's find out then what is the film which somehow managed to beat Jaws. Yep, Race with the Devil is my number one for 1975. This is a film about two middle-aged couples who are going on this holiday. They've got this luxury mobile home, and the idea is they're just going to drive it across Texas and camp in a different spot every night. But one night they accidentally come across this cult in the woods who are in the middle of sacrificing this blonde woman as part of their latest ritual, and so they quickly flee the scene, but the cultists see them fleeing. So for the rest of the movie, it's like a chase across Texas between this luxury mobile home and all these cultists. But the scary thing about it is we've got no idea what these guys, these cultists, look like. And we don't know how many of them there are either. I mean, we're watching this film thinking there could be like just 5 or 10 of them. There could be 1,000 of them. We just don't know what the reach is. And without giving anything away or without giving too much away, I love the fact that you never really get to the bottom in this movie of what this cult is all about. That just makes it even scarier. They're just a complete unknown. And I've seen this film multiple times, and every time I watch it, I'm always on the edge of my seat looking at every frame to see if maybe there's somebody in the background looking at the main characters in a weird way to suggest that maybe they're one of the cult members. The way that the film plays out, you could almost call it a thriller as well as a horror film, so don't be put off trying this movie if you're not necessarily into horror. It's a great story. I think it's quite a short film. It's only like maybe 85 minutes. I wish it was longer. It's a film which makes you, or leaves you wanting more, but at the same time, I know that if there was ever a longer cut of this film, or if it was remade and they showed more of it, then that would reduce its effectiveness. I just like the fact that this is just a short, sharp horror film with a great ending, a definitive ending, and it's not a very well-known film, I don't think, but I absolutely love it. This is a film which I have managed to get hold of, and it's definitely one that I rewatch now and again. It's got Peter Fonda in it, who I believe was quite a famous actor back, around about the 70s, probably a bit before my time. I don't know much of the stuff that he's done, and some of the other actors in the film, I think they were quite well-known names at the time, but maybe not to sort of my generation, grew up in the 80s, 90s, but I love Race with the Devil. It's a great film. I am thoroughly content with the fact that I have put it above Jaws, and more people should discover this film. It's probably not the sort of thing that modern day kids would watch. It's not the most overly violent film, but it's just a really creepy, scary horror film, and it definitely got to me when I was a teenager, just watching it alone in my room on TV at night. And yeah, that is my number one for 1975. So before we wrap up, let's ask ourselves the final question which needs asking. Only one really, which I've already mentioned, I think, when I was talking about the Ghoul, and that film is Legend of the Werewolf. I've written a few others down, but honestly, I'm not going to lose sleep over whether I ever get to see these films. Rollerball was a film that I might have watched if it was possible to rent it on Sky, but it wasn't, sadly. That's got James Caan in it. It's kind of like this futuristic game thing, a bit similar to The Running Man, maybe. I don't know, I've never seen it, obviously, but that sounded okay, but it just wasn't available to rent. There's a film called Trilogy of Terror, which might be an okay horror film. I think it's a made-for-TV film, I'm not sure. Dog Day Afternoon. Now, that's a film which my brother once told me was very, very good. It's got Al Pacino in it, but I've not seen it. And I guess One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest would be a film that maybe I should watch just because it's such a famous film, one of Jack Nicholson's best films, allegedly. I think it might have won awards, that film. It's one that, you know, people constantly talk about as being one of the classic films of cinema. It doesn't sound that good to me. It sounds like the sort of film that wouldn't really appeal to me, so it's why I've not made a massive effort to see it. But if you know any other movies from '75 which you think I've missed out when I was doing this today, then by all means, you know, leave a comment below, and I'd be interested to hear that. But that aside, I'm all done. That is my rankings for 1975, and I will be back soon with a similar rankings for 1976. Until next time, cheerio, bye bye.